Um, I mean, the issue that this guy mentions, I think one of the biggest problems Africa has, that is being contributed by the some of the locals or indigenous themselves, is corruption. If corruption can be removed from most of these African countries, Africa is going to get to its height potentially, economic and otherwise. It will get to its height in a very, very short space of time. But then, if you look well enough, you see that the hand of some foreign influenced governments is also responsible, and then some of the sellouts within the African continent too, that prefer foreign aid and foreign handouts to actually becoming financially responsible and independent. So these are things that we need to really, really point clear as we progress in this video. Yes, okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. So today we're going to be reacting to another video, and as you know, on this channel, and especially on this particular series, I feature a wide range of issues, all right, things that are ultimately affecting the livelihood, well-being, welfare of Africans in Africa, particularly Nigerians in question. So today's speak, I stumbled upon this video that is titled an MIT study that features why Africa is still poor. All right. Well, I want to reserve my take concerning this video, but let's just sit back, relax, and see one or two things that we can learn from this study.
Is the poorest continent in the world, and as economic centres in Asia fully develop, it's unfortunately only falling further behind. Today, the majority of people in the world living on less than $1 a day live in Africa, and the income gap between a large share of African nations and developed nations has grown to a factor of 40 or 50. Now, addressing an entire...
Now, wait. Let's pause it a bit. This guy is saying, is categorizing Africa as poor based on the fact that they live on less than $1 a day. All right. Well, capital wise, you might say that there might be some element of truth in that because of the exchange rate and all that, but saying Africa is actually poor is, I think, is more of an understatement. All right, it's completely an understatement because Africa is actually rich in human resources. All right, what Africa is poor on is the leadership. The African people themselves are not poor. If you have African people as poor, you won't be having the biggest, one of the richest people in the world in Nigeria. All right. Neither will you be seeing a lot of entrepreneurs and inventors and innovators that are not even depending on the dollar exchange, come out of Africa, and particularly Nigeria. So I think that thing is a narrative that is just being pushed. It's just like saying that Africans are living on trees. You need to come to some of these African countries to see how comfortable they are living, even in their huts. All right, than just being depressed by certain factors like gun violence and some other things that are so much prevalent in the West. All right, this narrative they push, I always take it with a grain of salt, and I also encourage my subscribers to also do the same, because sometimes this is the reason why they keep pushing Africa into loans and certain aids in quotes. These aids, this financial aid and all that they keep boxing Africa in, and they give you aid with one hand, they take a huge chunk of things with the other hand. So these are things that we really need to take cognizance of.
Continent as a single economic case study is normally a silly endeavour. There are 54 countries in Africa, each with their own economic systems, governments, challenges and opportunities. Asking sweeping questions about the economy of all of them at the same time would be like assuming that the USA and Ecuador had the same economic dynamics. But when it comes to poverty, this is a relatively universal problem across all of Africa. Yes, there are outliers like the Seychelles, Mauritius and even Botswana, but most of their economic output is unstable at best and based on dubious tax systems. Even then, the nation with the highest GDP per capita on the continent would be lower middle income in Europe or North America. This makes the question of why is Africa poor even more important to answer. The fact that most countries across the continent are undeveloped led a team of economists from MIT to look for underlying reasons that go deeper than individual national issues to see if there are common barriers to economic development in Africa that are not present in other regions around the world. Finding and understanding these issues, if they exist, has the potential to guide economic policy and aid efforts to address the root of the problem rather than band-aiding over the symptoms. So, what were the foundational issues, if any, that the MIT researchers found when trying to answer this question? How can these issues be fixed? And finally, is there any reason for optimism on what is otherwise a fairly disheartening problem? While the economy of an entire country requires thousands of people to manage, you might feel a little overwhelmed just trying to manage your own life all by yourself. I, for one, got a bit lost last year and resolved that this year I would tackle my problem. Economic success tends to lead to more economic success, and economic challenges, unfortunately, do the same. Today, countries across Africa deal with a combination of problems that the world is perhaps overly familiar with. Political instability, corruption, and the destruction of capital makes it riskier for industries to get established on the continent, which means that people don't have access to economically valuable opportunities, which causes impoverished populations, which causes even more political instability. There are modern problems on top of this as well. As the world has opened up to international trade and workers, it's become harder for African industries to compete.
You know what? The issue that this guy mentions, I think one of the biggest problems Africa has that is being contributed by some of the locals or indigenous themselves is corruption. If corruption can be removed from most of these African countries, Africa is going to get to its height, potentially, economic and otherwise. It will get to its height in a very, very short space of time. But then, if you look well enough, you see that the hand of some foreign influenced governments is also responsible. And then some of the sellouts within the African continent too, that prefer foreign aid and foreign handouts to actually becoming financially responsible and independent. So these are things that we need to really point clear as we progress in this video.
And easier for talented African workers to leave to find better opportunities in richer countries.
Brain drain.
Issues are well documented.
Now, in that, in that particular, this particular newspaper headline I was shown, you can see some keywords there. He's talking about brain drain, and the brain drain itself. Despite this mass immigration of Africans and Nigeria to diaspora, you discover that Africa still has a very huge reserve of brilliant minds. Those that are migrating and going for greener pastures or going for alternative immigration status or permanent residency and all that. These people are not even as much as those who are remaining, because the people remaining in Africa are far beyond those who are leaving. All right, so everything still boils down to leadership. If Africa, particularly Nigeria, could have a good and functional, responsible leadership, you will discover that a lot of these people will not even go out there, because a lot of them, we see their comments online, how they do odd jobs. Some of them do odd jobs. Only very few of them have very good jobs from corporations or probably from the foreign government and the likes. But the rest just go there, just do one job to the next, until they grow old. And some of them do very dangerous jobs that could even be very detrimental to their health. So these are factors to look at. When you're talking about brain drain, where really is the brain drain going? These people that are being carried out, where are they going? And in the real sense of it, are they actually making it there? Or are they just being used for a specific end of their host countries?
And well understood, but they are symptoms of other underlying problems. So why has Africa so universally continued to struggle with this vicious cycle where countries in every other continent around the world haven't had the same issues or have been able to address them? A good start would be geography. Almost like a real-time strategy game, where countries exist on a map does have an impact on their early game development. Land is is one of the factors of production alongside labour and capital, but in a way it's almost the foundational factor of production because even in the earliest civilizations spanning back thousands of years, good land could support more people. The more people that were supported by the land, the more they could specialise in technical areas of a society outside of just hunting, gathering or farming for food to survive. Now, obviously Africa is massive, but land in the economic sense also extends to other aspects of geography as well, like how fertile that land is, access to drinking water, and in the late game, access to raw materials and trade routes. Anytime economists look at the poverty experienced in Africa, they almost without fail mention the abundance of natural resources that exists across the continent, from precious metals, fossil fuels, diamonds, and even rare earths that have become vital to the electric.
Now, I can see something there. This guy is bringing up something regarding Congo. Why Congo is so poor? Is it not the same Congo that we had? That there was an event where some foreign mercenaries were seen trying to overthrow the government. So these narratives that they keep putting forward, boxing Africa into, is sometimes you really need to look very carefully. And like I said, take it with a grain of salt because you don't really know the motives behind. There was a time, I think during Obasanjo's time as the president of Nigeria, one of them gave a research similar to this. He was talking about how Nigeria is going to split in 2015, into the several parts, and all that. I remember the government of Nigeria then threw that particular research out because it was just forecasting, doom in some sort. It was forecasting some kind of terrible thing and about Nigeria and the likes. So the narrative some of these people push it probably because they has been sponsored by some foreign interests, who just want to paint the picture in an odd way, in a distorted way. So, like I said, Congo itself was recently almost overthrown. The government was overthrown by some foreign mercenaries, who had their own interests, their own agenda in that country. And I think that Nigeria too needs to cut its ties with some of these foreign interests and focus on its local interests. I recently heard that the price of gas, local gas for cooking gas, dropped because Nigeria stopped exporting its cooking gas. It focused more on its local population. I've often talked about local development. It's very, very important, and if a country has to develop, the local content is important, is an integral part of any economic growth. But if a foreign based interest keeps taking the center stage, then underdevelopment will persist.
Electrification of the global economy, the trillions of dollars buried in the continent's soil makes the poverty all the more heartbreaking. Because while the land is so abundant in this respect, that same land has worked against the people that inhabit it for thousands of years, and have put them in a position where today, when those resources are at their most valuable, they are ill-equipped to take advantage of them. The most obvious place to start is simply how isolated most of the continent has been. The Sahara Desert divides the continent east to west, and for most of human history has effectively acted as a large ocean, making most of the land to the south an island, physically separated from a lot of the societal developments that took place along the trading routes between Europe, the Middle East and Asia. Even today, the countries in northern Africa along the Mediterranean are more integrated in global affairs and are generally more developed than countries in the south and centre of the continent. The Sahara Desert is such an economically significant geographic feature that economists will often look at northern Africa and sub-Saharan Africa as two completely separate entities. Both have their problems, but sub-Saharan Africa's tends to be long-standing. Being isolated from even early global trade and the spread of ideas and technology put the south of the continent behind their northern neighbours, and it would also later open them up to exploitation from technologically superior regions that would establish connections to the continent in ways that were not mutually beneficial, to put it mildly. Beyond that, the land itself is not particularly fertile. Making the transition to productive agriculture is one of the most significant things humanity has ever done. But it was obviously easier to take that step where the land was more naturally fertile. The Sahara Desert clearly isn't ideal for farming, but even the most seemingly fertile lands in the centre of the continent have poor soil quality that is prone to rapid erosion unless it's carefully managed by even the most advanced modern farming techniques. An ancient civilization would have found it very hard to develop agriculture given these factors, and there was also no real incentive to. In lush areas where agriculture would have been possible, it was just easier to forage or hunt for food, rather than invest the effort into developing farms. Sub-Saharan Africa is also an environment that is very inhospitable to structured development. The most fertile areas are rife with tropical diseases, insects, and wildlife that generally favour human groups that remain spread out and mobile. Anthropologists compare these with theories they have around other early developments that revolve around something they call the trap of sedentism. This is where human groups would find an area so lush with life and abundant in resources that were important to early humans, like fresh water, wood, and the lack of predators, that they would just become sedentary in that area for generations until they depleted everything they could hunt or gather. At that point, agriculture becomes the only option if the group has lost their nomadic ways. These Gardens of Eden, as anthropologists call it, didn't really exist in Africa, so people had to stay in smaller groups and they had to keep moving. Today, this has resulted in a continent that has many different ethnic groups that speak hundreds of languages and have very different cultural norms. Even though the continent is divided amongst a lot of different countries, those countries themselves are often individually divided between many different groups. The large number of haphazardly drawn borders also causes other economic problems too. Yes, this is in large part still thanks to the shadow left by colonialism, but we still need to get to that. As it relates to just using the land as a factor of production for economic...
Well, I'm happy he's mentioning colonialism because he was initially trying to push the narrative that it was he's trying to blame the distribution or the rich diversity in Africa to its poverty. But then he has mentioned that, and I'm so happy he did that. Let's continue.
Development. This dense cobweb of borders also means that many countries are cut off from the outside world because they don't have access to oceans for international trade. Transport infrastructure for trade is very minimal, and what does exist is either far from fully developed or are leftover rail tracks from colonial empires that are falling into disrepair and were only set up in the first place with the intention of exploiting resources rather than building an independent economy. The connections between countries are often at best dirt roads, and even those that are lucky enough to be directly on the ocean for a chance at getting involved in global trade still have other major geographic barriers. Most of the African coast, especially in the west, is raised and completely impractical to develop major shipping ports around. So before humans even existed, Africa was far from an ideal spawn location for mid to late game economic developments. These challenges also influence the other factors of production, including one that we rarely mention on this channel. Macroeconomists frequently talk about the way that land, labour and capital interact to influence an economy. In the case of Africa, it had land that was less than ideal for farming, trade and industry, which meant it had a smaller, more splintered population, labour, which meant that they were less concentrated in centres of commerce, which meant that instead of developing and sharing technologies and infrastructure, capital, they focused more on just surviving. But there was also another element, and that was entrepreneurship. Now, when economists talk about entrepreneurship as a factor of production, they're not just talking about people who go out and start a business. They're more referring to people, or even institutions, that can coordinate the other factors of production, land, labour and capital, into actually doing something useful. It should be noted that a lot of economists often just bundle this together with labour, because labour also considers not just how many people are working in an economy, but what their skills are as well. A more skilled workforce should be able to produce more economic output. Given that entrepreneurship is arguably...
He's mentioning something. The more skilled labor, the more, the more actually capable a country is in producing goods and services. And that is true. And that was one of those things that Hands-On Lab Software Academy is focused at doing.
Just another skill explains why these two are often merged together. But the economic case study of Africa may be one of the clearest examples of why this is important enough to be considered as its own separate element. Now, most of this is based on the work of Darren Acemoglu and James A. Robinson from MIT in their publication simply titled, Why is Africa Poor? We were lucky enough to speak directly with Professor Acemoglu, who, on top of publishing this paper, also wrote the legendary book Why Nations Fail, all while being one of the most prolific academic researchers in the history of economics. Needless to say, it was good to get his insights on such a complex issue.
Can you understand Ukraine today without its geography? No. Its entire history, especially recently, is because of the place that it is, next to Russia. So that's geography. And you cannot understand Saudi Arabia without its geography, meaning its endowments, oil. If Saudi Arabia didn't have oil, it would be a very different place today. So there are geographic factors that matter. But the question to which James Robinson and I gave a categorical answer, categorical no, is geography the main factor that explains the large gaps in income per capita and in prosperity around the world? And the answer to that is no. Institutions are overwhelmingly more important. You are absolutely right. Sub-Saharan Africa is really a jarring case of poverty, failure to develop economically, failure to build industry and
technology. Acemoglu and Robinson in their research look back to various groups around the continent and individual motivations for why they did or did not adopt certain technologies, even when they were made available to them. Even really simple technologies like a wheel weren't widely adopted. The cheap transportation that something this simple enables means that it becomes easier and easier for societies to develop outside of small village groups because resources can be traded between different areas, allowing people to specialise. If something like food, tools or building materials need to be transported by head porterage, where people just put heavy things directly on top of their head, then that's way less efficient than even a basic handcart. At that point, it just becomes easier for societal groups to be self-sufficient because it's so hard to do trade. Now, this wasn't unique to Africa. Indigenous Australians were also largely separated from the early exchange of technologies, and they too remained as mostly self-sufficient groups of hunters and gatherers until Western colonies were established there. If that's all there was to this story, then that would explain why Africa was historically behind the empires of the north, but it wouldn't explain why they remained behind. What Acemoglu and Robinson found interesting was that even after wheels became common knowledge on the continent, the studied groups still preferred to do things by hand, and there was no clear reason why, until they looked at the institutions ruling over these areas. By the time Western technology made it to Africa, regions such as the Congo were loosely run by kings that would rule by decree with little to no oversight. They would raise revenues through arbitrary taxes and take things by force where they saw fit. This pushed groups that wanted to avoid the rule of these unchecked leaders further away from the basic roads that existed in the region, so instead of developing a culture of trade and interdependence, the tyrannical ruling institutions encouraged exactly the opposite. Fractured, self-sufficient groups have carried through to the modern day, where even within the many borders of Africa, there are often dozens of different cultural groups within a country vying for political representation and power. In this kind of environment, it's easy for bad leaders to establish themselves in positions of power by appeasing to their group, and managing the country in such a way that it comes at the expense of everybody else, which means even a few hundred years later, it's risky for people to rely on the economy to provide them what they need. It might be much less efficient, but it's much safer for them to just look after themselves. It also wasn't...
Wait, I think he's mentioning something here that is actually happening in Nigeria. The tribes seeking for representation in government, and these fraudulent leaders finding their way to appeal their own tribes and becoming an established ruler of the state. I think is not too much of a good news or good story, but it's actually a fact that is happening, and I feel that for Nigeria and Africa to rise from its ashes, they need to look for competent people, irrespective of their background or ethnic background, but rather focus on the performance indicators that would give that particular leader that particular geographical region knows will contribute to the socio-economic development of that state, and not just a tribe or something. I think their study there is valid. It's true.
Worth putting too much effort into making even simple stuff like a handcart when it could just be seized by some absolute monarch at their whim. Now, of course, this did not happen in a vacuum, and it's impossible to look at the modern-day economic struggles of Africa without exploring conquest and colonialism. All of the challenges that the continent of Africa had with divided populations, inhospitable environments, and poor economic management was made significantly worse by the Atlantic slave trade and later colonial empire.
The poor economic management, I think, is one of the worst parts. It's actually kept Africa poor.
The basic economics of the slave trade were unfortunately almost brutally simple and preyed on a lot of the foundational weaknesses that we've been exploring so far. Colonial empires had established plantations in the newly discovered Americas, but unfortunately for them, unlike a lot of other colonies in the East Indies, the native population was dying out too quickly to be put to work growing exotic spices. So the Europeans needed to import a new labour force, and well, they weren't going to do it themselves, so they turned to Africa. A lot of the unchecked African rulers at the time already used slave labour themselves, and they were happy to participate in this horrifying industry in exchange for European technologies, particularly firearms. Guns were technically advanced tools, but unlike a lot of other technology, they didn't have the same problem with just being claimed because they were both property and a tool to enforce property rights all in one. So powerful groups could get tools to become even more powerful and profit from capturing their rivals to be sent overseas. The Europeans took this slave labour and put it to use in their new colonies to produce exotic goods to sell in Europe, and they used the proceeds to buy even more guns to sell back to Africa in exchange for more slave labour. The reason they didn't just set up colonies in Africa itself was because at this time, African groups, after a long history of fighting amongst themselves, were pretty powerful adversaries, especially on their home turf that was full of tropical diseases, dangerous animals, and below average soil anyway. It was just easier to sail across the Atlantic Ocean, which highlights just how tough Africa was to settle. Of course, this system didn't last forever. American colonies started claiming independence, and the Industrial Revolution meant that Western militaries grew far more powerful very quickly. In the 1600s, with wooden sail ships and early firearms, it just wouldn't have been economically viable to colonise Africa, like European powers were doing with other regions around the world. But with modern armies, steamships, and basic treatments for tropical diseases, the large continent of Africa started to look very attractive as a colony, especially since it was filled with resources that were suddenly very useful in the industrial era. This time period on the continent was truly horrific, to the point where we can't go into too much detail or this video will just get taken off YouTube. But from a purely macroeconomic perspective, this laid the foundation for a lot of the government problems the continent still struggles with to this day. When colonial powers moved out of Africa, they took with them their tools, ruling structures, and industrial relations. Education on the continent was almost non-existent, and now a lot of groups couldn't even go back to their traditional way of life. Violent power grabs happened across the continent, and even if the leaders that seized power were completely benevolent, they had no training on what goes into running an effective government. Now, of course, a lot of leaders across the continent have not been benevolent, and instances of corruption, well, they've been known to happen.
At independence, some of Africa had the beginnings of the bureaucratic system, a court system, etc., that Europeans themselves had set up. But those were mostly in the main population centers, in the main urban centers. They had not penetrated society. They had not become completely legitimized. In fact, Europeans often destroyed more legitimate indigenous institutions when they tried to build their own for reasons of control. For example, the British colonizing Nigeria, they tried to introduce their own ruling families in places like Sierra Leone as well. And when they left, the skeleton of institutions were not very useful for building new economic activities, but they were very amenable for a strong man to take them over and use them for extraction.
The natural resources that should be Africa's golden ticket to economic prosperity have in many instances just been used by despotic leaders as their own personal piggy bank to secure their own power. Constant political upheaval and the continued rule of unchecked authorities means that the continent as a whole has taken a serious reputational hit, to the point where any industry across Africa is inherently seen as more risky than a similar industry in another continent. This means Africa has struggled to get funding for even basic projects with huge potential upsides because it's just considered too risky. Now, sometimes this reputation is earned. A few months ago, we looked at the conflict unfolding in Niger and how it was halting the development of an oil pipeline, one of the easiest infrastructure projects to ever see a return on investment from, but even still, in the geopolitically uncertain country, it was just not worth the risk. Now, fortunately, while this situation almost seems hopeless, there is room for optimism. A lot of the underlying issues with the failed development of solid institutions to manage economic development are starting to show positive signs of progress. Robinson and Asimoglu's paper was written more than 13 years ago now, and a lot has changed since then.
Botswana is one of the fastest growing countries over the last 60 years since its independence. And if you look at Botswana, it has all of the problems that others attribute to Africa. It is a landlocked country. It is not an easy country to navigate because of its richness of all sorts of natural barriers to moving around and other issues. It has diamonds, which have been called a curse for other African countries. It also started its independence period dirt poor and without much road or any type of educated elite. But it built better institutions for a variety of reasons. We can get into them if you are interested. But it built better institutions. It created stable property rights. It created a democracy that has worked reasonably well over time. It never led to a system where the court system was biased towards one group versus another. It invested in people, in education, in public infrastructure. It managed the diamond wealth well, and it's achieved this relatively high level of income.
But it will be a mixed bag, and it will take some time. Interest rates across the world right now are high, which means international investors are even less attracted to places like Africa, since they can get good returns by just buying extremely safe investments. When cash is earning less than 1%, they might be a bit more motivated to look at Africa as an option again. The continent is also, again, embroiled in a number of very high-profile conflicts, which is making even countries like China take a step back and see how this all plays out. Nobody can predict the future, least of all economists, but it also must be remembered that just 50 years ago, most of Asia was in the same economic situation as most of Africa today. 300 years ago, a blink of an eye in the grand scheme of human history, even the wealthiest Western nations had a similar economic output to the continent today. One of the most poignant takeaways from Acemoglu and Robinson's research is that economic success tends to lead to more economic success. Most economies throughout history have been stagnant until they weren't. If Africa's time does come, it could be an economic success story the same as every other region that was plagued by problems until they made the first breakthrough. Our full interview with Professor Acemoglu is available to listen to ad-free on Spotify and every other popular music streaming platform. We briefly touched on the problem of modern-day corruption in this video, but it's something that we can...
So let's just, in summary, okay, my main takeaway from this MIT study, okay, that seems to say or have a study that reviews why Africa is poor. They made certain points actually, like the corruption index and probably some other things, some other factors like management, the management, and then the skills too. The skill set issues are absolutely in all for that. But the other aspect that is talking about Africa living less than $1 a day and all that, some of these places that people are actually living less than $1 a day are places that are actually still being heavily controlled by foreign powers. And specifically, I mean, especially the francophone countries. Look at Cameroon, look at Burkina Faso and others. But some of these countries are actually, taking their future into their hands, and they no longer want to make remittances to a foreign colonial, in quote, master. So they are taking responsibility. And if the leaders these leaders can do the needful, I think that the economic recovery of these countries will be very, very unique, because you see that a lot of Africans that migrate towards the West do this in search of greener pastures because of bad leadership and because of local things that are not working right. Okay, but then even in the midst of these bad leadership and issues, infrastructural issues that was mentioned in this study, you still see some outliers. I mean, I've mentioned a lot of outliers. You can imagine someone in Nigeria that owns one of the biggest airline fleets in Nigeria. And you also have people, okay, like for instance, let me take for instance the owners of Paystack. They were just young guys that started walking around and doing something, and before you know it, Stripe in Ireland invested into as a venture capital, ventured into them, and whoa, they got the capital they needed to expand their business and their services. So all is not lost. That's just what I was saying. Okay, Africa has challenges, yes, accepted, but then there are still outliers, and some of these outliers are potential change makers that is going to make Africa better. So let's not give up in or for Africa. All right, let's just keep the hope alive. If you enjoyed this video, please ensure to subscribe to this channel. We need subscribers. We need Patreons. I've created a Patreon page. You can join our Patreon and help Hands-On Lab Software Academy reach its goals and its targets by helping people to learn skills. All right, so till next time, cheers and all the best.